This is The World Unpacked. I'm your host, Doug. Welcome back. Russia and Europe have a complicated energy relationship. Russia supplied Europe up until the beginning of the Ukraine war with a ton of natural gas and oil that power businesses, heat homes, and are a vital component of the energy mix of the entire European Union. Once the war started, Russia began to wield its energy as a threat, as a piece of leverage over Europe, who had initiated a really severe sanctions regime against the Russians in response to their invasion of Ukraine. Now, with winter approaching, Europe is thinking about how they're going to deal with the short-term problems of losing a ton of their energy and the long-term problems of a transition to green energy. Here to explain the complexity of all of those problems is Judy Dempsey, the editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe. Before we get going, I also want to note that this will be my last episode as host. It's been a lot of fun talking to all the different people in Carnegie and beyond about these important foreign policy issues. The World Unpacked isn't going anywhere, so stay tuned for more episodes with a new host after a short break. And for one last time, here we go. Judy, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Doug, for having me.
So I want to start with kind of the personal. You're based in Berlin. What does the energy crisis look like to you in your daily life?
Well, in my personal daily life, the bank account is getting quite weak. For instance, we were paying for gas about equivalent between $200 and $300 a month. And now it's shot up to over $800. Electricity have shot up as well. And in some ways, I regard myself as fortunate because we arranged a very special contract last year. But I know colleagues and friends, it's gone up 400% or 500%. And we are the middle class. And the consequence is that we've cut back on consumer spending. And I just dread to think what's happening to those who have very, very small incomes. They may have smaller apartments, but that doesn't deny the fact that they still have to pay much, much more for electricity and gas and these utilities. It's becoming a big political issue.
So speaking of politics, obviously the EU has said basically we need to cut back 15% of energy usage. Obviously governments don't want to just say that to people and then not help them. So what is the German government doing to try to soften the blow?
The German government has decided to give out handouts to those who cannot afford to pay their bills. This will amount to 300 or 400 euros, a one-off payment. Maybe there'll be extra. And then they have announced a package for the small and medium-sized companies. And remember, these companies are the backbone of the German economy, but also they are energy intensive, especially the industrial products. So they're suffering badly. And even on small little shops like bakeries, the price of bread has shot up because, again, baking bread is quite energy intensive. So the government is acutely aware of this crisis. We're coming into the winter. And so they're trying to arrange an enormous billions of package subsidies to see us through the winter. I'm a little bit more optimistic than all the complaints in the German media.
So would you characterize the sort of German public's view of this as solidarity with Ukraine, ready to bear the costs of the energy shortfall, or are there cracks appearing?
The cracks are there among the far left and the far right Alternative for Germany party. And they wanted demonstrations every Monday against the price hikes and against the German policy of supporting Ukrainians. And they want negotiations with President Vladimir Putin. They are rather pro-Russian, frankly, as are the far left. But in terms of the political class as such, it's holding together. Actually, it is quite remarkable. It's holding together. The communication could be much, much better. Why are the energy prices coming up? The energy prices are high because Germany particularly depended on Russian gas. And now we know that Russia under President Putin has used gas to the extreme levels of a geopolitical instrument in actually blackmailing Europe because the European Union actually imposes sanctions. But the cracks are there, but they're not quite visible and they're not being completely articulated.
So I want to back up for a second. The energy mix in Europe has long been pretty varied, right? Coal, gas, France, well known to produce a lot of nuclear power, so much they export it. Germany also had a pretty reasonably sized nuclear power base, which they moved to shut off, and obviously now perhaps are regretting that. But I kind of want to understand how Russia became such a vital supplier of energy to Europe, and in particular Germany, when it could have been sort of obvious to a lot of people, maybe in hindsight, that this would be a strategic problem.
Well, certainly the United States always thought it was going to be a strategic gamble, because remember this gas pipeline, let's forget about Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 that were recently built. The old West German government had this extraordinary deal with the former Soviet Union in the early 70s to build a gas pipeline between the Soviet Union and West Germany that would bring gas right across Ukraine. Remember, it was part of the Soviet Union, and right into West Germany. And this was built on the premise, well, this is about Eastern policy. This is about cooperation. It'll stabilize Europe. It'll reach out to the Soviet Union. It'll be a more stable, cooperative relationship despite the ideological problem. And the United States was highly critical of this, but the West German government went ahead with it. And now, as a result, actually, Germany did not diversify its energy supplies. It relied completely on the Soviet Union for 60 or 70% of its gas. And now we see this whole danger of dependency.
So in the short term, obviously, there's going to be cuts and pain. And we talked about that in your personal life, but also in Germany and the rest of Europe. Are the European member states also ready to handle sort of the coming winter and the pain of this energy transition in the short term?
The interesting thing about the 27 member states is that they have very different views of this energy crisis. So the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia and Poland, they have depended, although they have diversified more or less on Russian energy, and now they have bought alternative supplies of energy. The interesting issue is, even though they are poorer than Germany, less well off, the public is right behind their governments because they support the Ukrainian offensive against the Russian occupation and the Russian war. This is very, very interesting. And so there are no complaints about the energy prices. This is the price to pay for sovereignty, for freedom, for the European Union, for Ukraine, for independence. It's very, very interesting. And then you get other countries. There's a bit of moaning. It's not that articulate, but, this Ukraine thing, maybe we could negotiate with Russia. It's quite low key at the moment because the support for Ukraine is still very strong.
The European Commission has said a united Europe will prevail over Russian President Vladimir Putin. In her annual State of the
But
Union.
nevertheless, the price rises are beginning to feed into the political constellation. We see this in France, where President Emmanuel Macron is trying to put on a price cap. But one thing I have to say, especially about France as a nuclear power, France has really messed up its nuclear power industry. This was the most sophisticated, outgoing, well-run nuclear sector. And over the years, they neglected it to the extent that some of the nuclear plants, because of the lack of maintenance, really don't function. And what you have to remember is that guess who's selling energy to France now? It is Germany. So it is very interesting, and it brings in the whole complicated issue of whether or not there is solidarity among all the EU member states about shouldering these energy prices, agreeing on subsidies and pulling together on this.
You mentioned the price cap, and I know this is basically an effort to try to mitigate, especially the short-term shock that the elimination of Russian energy on the market will have. So right now, there's a leak supposedly in Nord Stream 1. Gas isn't flowing. Putin's obviously threatened to cut off gas supplies to Europe altogether if the Europeans impose this price cap. But obviously there's issues on the Kremlin side because they need the money to fund the war, and they've had these battlefield losses that have been well reported this week. So I want to dive into this and start with the price cap. Is this a realistic policy response that's going to have an effect on the problem of the lack of Russian energy?
The price cap is popular for some governments, but the German government is against it. It's certainly not for market reasons. Maybe it's because of its weakening but relationship with Russia. Nevertheless, this price cap would actually reduce the kind of money flowing into the Russian coffers to actually finance this war. But at the moment, there isn't a consensus among the 27 member states about going ahead with this. So both the EU and the Commission, the executive of the EU, have to find alternative ways about dealing with these price hikes. And in some ways, actually, the member states are going their own way in terms of the level of subsidies, in terms of the level, how can they see through the winter, especially in filling up the storages. And this is already happening, but the price cap hasn't been actually agreed on yet.
So what about Putin's side of this? I mean, he's obviously been very threatening and feels that he seems to at least say publicly he has leverage through the energy that he supplies to Europe. But they need this money. It's not like a total zero sum for them either. So do you think, or do policymakers think in Europe that Putin might be bluffing or overplaying his leverage here with Russian energy for Europe?
I don't think the word is bluffing. I think Putin just has to look at the statistics. For instance, until recently, Germany relied on 40 to 50, 55% of Russian gas. And now it's gone down to about between 6 and 10%. And it's the same with Poland. Ukraine is a very different matter because it's a big transit country, but the actual dependence on Russia has radically increased. And if you were sitting on the Gazprom board, this is the state-run gas industry run by Putin, you'd be really worried about what's going to happen to the revenues. And the very interesting aspect of this war is that it has finally forced the Europeans to reduce their dependence on Russia and also to revisit the whole idea of dependence on other countries for energy. One other point that's very important, there's meant to be a sort of consensus in the EU that we have to break this dependence on Russia. But as ever, you get some black sheep in the family, and Hungary under Prime Minister Viktor Orban has done his own special bilateral contract with Gazprom to secure energy supplies for the winter. So it's not all that clear-cut, but the majority of member states say enough is enough. The dependence game is over. We have to look ahead, diversify, and actually radically restructure our energy resources.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I want to get into the long-term implications of that, especially with respect to the green energy transition. But before we zoom out a little more, I want to stay with this sort of contemporary. And I'm sitting in the United States. The war in Ukraine remains a sort of reasonably large headline, especially this week because of the gains the Ukrainian army have in the east. But it's also, other things have come up here. I'm curious how the European public thinks about the Ukraine war after all these months. Is it still top of mind, or is it sort of fading a little bit into the background?
If you look at the media across Europe, after 6 months, it is actually still a few weeks ago it was sort of on the second page or maybe in the bottom of the front page, but certainly on the second or third page. But this extraordinary offensive at the weekend has given a fillip to the Ukrainians and proved in some ways to those countries that do the supplies of military equipment, particularly the United States and the United States public coming up to the midterm, see, it's paying off. We can do this, and we've got to keep up supporting Ukraine. So in that sense, it's perhaps galvanized public opinion, although for some, especially in Southern Europe, Ukraine is a long way off. This is certainly the case that Ukraine has come back into play, and we see very strange rumors coming out of Moscow about what might be happening to the military, how Putin is going to deal with all this. But the curious thing is that there's a problem in Europe always focusing on Ukraine because we have so many issues also to deal with. One is the Middle East, but particularly the growing hunger and human rights violations in Afghanistan, for instance, where Europe just and NATO withdrew. But for the moment, Ukraine is the number one foreign policy issue for the Europeans and interesting for the Americans.
The European Union is obviously not one sort of unified bloc. And you've already mentioned Hungary, who has sort of wants to have a friendly relationship with Putin. But then obviously the Baltic states, who are, much more afraid of what Putin might do if he succeeds in Ukraine. And there's some states in between. So let's say Putin does it. He really goes to cut off gas supplies and really says, this is happening. You guys are on your own. Are you going to see sort of a real fracture in the European unity over this? And where might countries fall?
This is a multi-layered question. On the practical issues, the storage facilities are being filled rapidly throughout Europe and particularly Germany. This is very, very important.
Germany's Chancellor Scholz insists his country can make it through the winter without Russian gas, but Europe will need to reorganize its energy supplies.
And I say particularly in Germany because this is an export-led economy and it's still industrialized and it depends, its manufacturing depends on enormous amounts of energy. But the point is that Germany has gone to extraordinary lengths to buy energy at an enormous price. The price will fall eventually and markets will stabilize, but there's no going back to buy Russian gas. This is the first point. The second point is that the American administration has certainly stepped in with liquefied natural gas exports, and we're looking at Qatar and other countries. So the upside of this is that Europeans are rapidly learning how to diversify. But the third most important point about this issue of Ukraine is that it has shifted the whole geostrategic issue of energy. Over the years, energy flowed from Russia to Europe, from west to east, if I get that right. And it wasn't North and South Europe. And now we're getting energy flowing from the United States to Europe. And more importantly, because of the whole idea of linking all these grids, we're going to have energy flowing from North and Southern to Southern Europe as well. It's changing the whole energy setup. There's no doubt about this. And maybe this is one of the plus signs of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has made us lose our kind of comfort zone with Russia, and the whole foreign policy matrix is going to change.
When we come back, I'll ask Judy about the future of European energy and the green transition. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. We have a lot of fun putting this show together, but we can't do it without your generous support. To support the work that we do on this podcast and the work of the Carnegie Endowment, please visit ceip.org/donate. Thanks. All right, I want to pick up right where we left off. Russia is a pariah state. A colleague of ours, Sasha Kabuyev, described them as a giant Iran of Eurasia, right? And so, I mean, their role in the energy mix of Europe is probably tainted for decades. Even after the war ends, it's conceivable they won't be added back in after this disruption. So a positive spin on this might be Europe is going to lead the way on a green transition. How's that concept playing out? Do you think there's something to that?
It's a mixed picture. The green transition was the number one agenda for the European Commission and the European member states over the last maybe 18 months. I mean, and also don't forget that Europe and the European Union, it set itself up as the world leader in promoting climate change and the green transition. Now, there are two schools of thought about this. One is that the war in Ukraine is a big boost for renewable energy and the green transition. This war must speed up the transition to away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It needs government investment. It needs to communicate to the public why this has to happen, and it's got to be speeded up. It's going to cost an awful lot of money, but it's got to be speeded up. But then the other side, it says, hang on, we've got a huge energy crisis here. Let's go back to coal. And this is an extraordinary development. We have this social democratic government led in Berlin, and its big partner is the Greens, plus the Free Democrat Liberals. And the Greens, who are so anti-nuclear and so anti-coal, have agreed to open up the coal fields, a couple at least, to see through the winter, but they will not deal with the nuclear issue. And there's 3 plants that are due to be closed this year. They're still running. They're still in good shape. And there's such a division inside the Green Party, and we know there's an energy crunch, that the Greens will not go down this road even to prolong the nuclear industry. It may change at the moment, but what's at issue here is a total paradox in the German political class, that the Greens, who are so pro-climate protection, are opening the coal fields but not embracing nuclear energy even for another year. Also, just to finish this point, the green transition is extremely unpopular because it's costly. And also there are countries, for instance, like Romania, but particularly Poland, which has a huge coal sector. The transition is going to be costly. It's got to be explained. You've got to bring everybody on board. Perhaps, again, maybe a plus side, Russia's war in Ukraine will actually galvanize public opinion and say, this is the time to really push ahead with the green transition.
I want to dive into the nuclear issue a little bit, because given the forcing mechanism of the war in Ukraine and the fact that European nations, Germany and France in particular, have exceptional nuclear power programs, at least historically, why is it that there's not a more popular move towards reopening these plants, maybe even opening some new ones?
It's a psychological issue. It's one of fear. It's one of the memory of what happened in Japan 7 or 8 years ago. It's the feeling of the invisibility of this kind of energy, and of Chernobyl and what's happening now in eastern Ukraine. It's an invisible psychological fear that there's something about nuclear energy which is so dangerous. And then don't forget what happened in Japan towards the end of the Second World War. And it's deeply ingrained in the German psyche, a little bit in Britain, but it's out there. And it's very hard to change this mindset. It's curiously, it's not dominant in France. And there's a particular reason for this, because France has always prided its military independence, its economic special independence, and particularly its energy independence, which is nuclear. And so for the French political class, even for the French public, the nuclear issue isn't a big issue. What is a big issue? That the French government actually has neglected it, and the nuclear authority. But, this is a separate issue. So the acceptance of nuclear power is not universal. It's quite critical. It's very complicated for the societies, and particularly in Austria and parts of Central Europe.
There's got to be a tension here between what it'll be a longer and, as you said, unpopular transition towards green energy versus like, hey, there's coal in the ground. Let's just dig it up and light it on fire and it'll power our homes. I mean, do you have a sense of who might win out? I mean, this is a little concerning especially for climate people who are worried that, the necessity of powering business and heating homes will just return coal to a prominent place.
There won't be the return to coal, for the simple reason that it's very costly, but there's a younger generation coming up that just don't want this. And the older generation can no longer ignore the younger generation's embrace of renewable energy and of green energy and of this transition. And I think younger generation also do realize the cost. This is the first thing. Secondly, governments are giving enormous subsidies to renew buildings, to deal differently with how construction is carried out. It will take time, but it's beginning to filter down. Of course, a lot depends on where you come from, what you're used to, how you want to insulate windows and roofs and everything else. But it's certainly out here in Germany, the extraordinary subsidy package given to households who are prepared to renovate their houses is absolutely extraordinary. And the queue is unending to get these subsidies. So I think it's going to be long, but I think the green transition, there'll be hiccups. The European Union is very bad at sticking to deadlines, but it's out there. And I think in the United States too, it's out there. And if we can come together on this, we can push it forward and make the Paris Agreement much more robust.
I want to turn to the political implications of the energy crisis. And the outgoing Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, said, "We must avoid the mistakes made after 2008. The energy crisis must not produce a return to populism." I mean, a return to populism is, maybe calling something finished before it has. But what do you make of this? Do you think the energy crisis might create sort of worrying political outcomes in European states?
It would be very foolish of any politician to play down this energy crisis. Bills are going up for all kinds of consumers, from the low paid to the middle class, even to the high paid. I mean, I know of some IT people who were set up their own businesses and they decided they just couldn't meet the bills, and then they went back into industry to actually make sure they can get through this winter. And it's just not this winter, it's going to be the next winter as well. I think there's got to be an element of serious solidarity across the European Union. And in today's annual speech by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she mentioned a huge subsidy package for small and medium-sized industry, which really are very important for the European economy, because she realizes, and this is another aspect of the energy crisis, the energy crisis and the energy prices will reduce consumer spending. And if you reduce consumer spending, you actually weaken the credibility of the euro. And if you weaken the credibility of the euro, you actually weaken the credibility of Europe as a global economic and trading power. And so the spin-offs are huge. And so the member states realize this more and more.
I want to stick with economics for a second. Thank you for bringing it up. I mean, obviously, Germany in particular is very well known for a manufacturing sector of high technology goods. That's obviously powered by energy. We don't have to just talk about Germany, but I mean, what do you think the knock-on impacts of both the short and the longer term energy crisis will have on Europe's role in the global economy?
The energy crisis comes in the wake of COVID, and it comes further in the wake of the big financial crisis. And these three crises has made it incredibly difficult for Europe really to fully recover and find its place, strong say or place in the global economy. The recovery has been slow and quite unsteady. And the Russia war in Ukraine, combined with COVID, has created a double wake-up call for Europe. The first is, because of COVID, the whole weaknesses or unpredictability of globalization. Globalization was the buzzword until COVID came. Then the supply chains broke down. You couldn't even get a tire for a bicycle because it came from China. The cargo systems, the commercial trading links and channels shipping channels were all upset. COVID created immense disruption to globalization. And COVID also instilled or started a major debate in the big economies in Europe about the future of globalization, and much more importantly, the interdependence and the dependence of European economies, particularly on China. And this is a really interesting aspect of COVID that really hasn't gone away. The globalization issue is so number one here in Europe, especially in Italy, in France, and in Germany, particularly in Germany, whose economy is so intertwined with the Chinese economy. Coming on top of this is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which brings in another side not only the crisis of globalization with COVID, but the crisis of dependence. And so this is generating an enormous debate. It's not public. It's in the think tanks. It's among industry. It's among enterprises. Should we actually repatriate our production, our manufacturing? Should we change our model? Should we deindustrialize? So essentially, these debates have begun.
You mentioned China. We've talked a lot about Russia, obviously. How has the energy crisis altered the US-EU relationship, if at all?
It's a really interesting question. I'm pretty upbeat about this, actually, but I know there's a lot of anti-American sentiment in parts of Europe, suggesting that the Biden administration is exploiting the energy crisis in Europe to actually export lots of LNG gas to Europe. Actually, the Biden administration has been very interesting on two fronts, is stiffening the backbone of the Europeans when it comes to defending Ukraine, but also saying to the Europeans, listen, diversify, reduce your dependence. We can help you with this element of gas and other elements of energy. So I'm rather optimistic. It's not, I suppose, my trait when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. But I think we could do much, much more to actually exploit what's going on now with how the administration has really been pushing the Europeans to realize what their security interests are if they don't back Ukraine, and telling the Europeans and helping them, listen, there's a bit of solidarity here. We can help you with the LNG and building LNG terminals and other things. But there's much more to be done.
We try very hard to be optimistic on this podcast, and given that it's a foreign policy podcast, we often fail. Although I sort of agree with you that in the medium and long term, if this speeds European leadership in a transition on green energy and rebuilds a transatlantic relationship, obviously that's great. In the short term, though, I have to revert to the mean of pessimism here. There's a lot of challenges for Europe in the very short term, especially this winter, if it's a very cold winter. And so, unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you, what are you really worried about? What are some really possible dangerous outcomes from this short-term energy crunch that Europe is facing?
If I really want to put it on the humane level, it's about people freezing. It's about the homeless. It's about people on very, very low incomes. I worry about the safety net not being wide enough and thick enough to protect them. And these are a class of people that will not protest. But if there are casualties, heaven forbid, and if people die or get very sick, they will be exploited by populist parties. There's no doubt about this. And leaders of these popular parties, they will weather the storm with the energy crisis, but they will exploit every conceivable major illness or whatever happens during this energy crisis. This is the first thing. What I worry also is that governments must not neglect how to communicate. They must be compassionate, humane, and explain what's behind this. This is not the Ukrainian offensive that is behind this. This is President Vladimir Putin using energy to actually turn around the European view of the sanctions. And governments across the EU should explain to the publics, this is what's happening. It's not the people in Ukraine defending their independence or their sovereignty or fighting for it. This is Russia actually using energy as a serious blackmail, and governments should communicate this. And the final thing is that governments should work hand in hand in industry and civil society, saying, we've got to get through this together. The subsidies, yes, at the end of the day, it'll affect the budget deficit and the taxpayers, but we have to get through this because this is important about European stability, European security, and actually the future of the economic and political direction of Europe.
Judy, thank you so much for explaining this complicated issue to us and for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Doug. And I just want to say we're going to miss you very, very much.
I appreciate that. I'll miss you and the rest of our colleagues here at Carnegie as well. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.